You may think you have seen this case on my channel before with the case of Mr. Cruel. However, this is very much a different story, but with some similar themes. This case takes place in Australia between the years of 1979 and 1980. On the 10th of December 1979, a man who called himself Mark Chapman walked into a gun store in Burleigh Head and purchased a Glenfield .22 caliber rifle. Whoever this man was, Mark Chapman was not his real name. He left the store with the weapon after providing an address where he claimed to live, although he had faked his place of residency too. And just 5 days later, this so-called Mark Chapman would use the weapon in a series of disturbing crimes. On the 15th of December 1979, in the scenic paradise that is the Gold Coast, a woman was abducted at gunpoint from her home. She was reading when a man wearing a balaclava broke in and forced her to get into the back of her car. He then drove them to the Gold Coast hinterlands, and once arriving in a secluded location, this masked man forced himself upon the woman in the backseat of the car. After this twisted crime, he then forced her into the boot of the vehicle, drove to a beach, and left. The hot summer sun was beating down, leaving the woman trapped in an intensely hot car with no way to get out. Thankfully, she was rescued when passers-by heard her screams and were able to take her to safety. The incident was reported to the police, where the woman gave a description of the man who was wearing a balaclava at the time, and police got to work right away to find the culprit. The investigators had a strong feeling that the masked man would strike again. And just 2 weeks later, he would. In Cabarita on the 24th of December 1979, the very same man ambushed a couple in their parked car. At gunpoint, the masked man essayed the woman in front of her boyfriend as he was forced to watch. After the attack was over, the masked man apologized and fled from the scene. The following day in Carabata, another couple were attacked inside their car by a man wearing a balaclava. The woman was forced to bind her husband's hands. Once he was bound, the masked man made the husband watch as he forced himself upon his wife. These two incidents were reported to the police, where it became evidently clear that they were now dealing with a serial attacker. Every victim described the attacker the same way, an athletic man with steely blue eyes and bushy eyebrows. They also claimed that he smelled of motor oil. What struck the investigators as incredibly strange is that despite committing the most heinous of crimes, the masked man always was polite to the victims and would even go as far as to apologize to them. And on the 28th of December 1979, another couple were attacked in their farmhouse. The woman was ordered to tape her partner's hands, and then she was essayed in his presence. And then in the new year, another couple were attacked. On the 25th of January 1980, whilst home together, the masked man broke in, and like the previous attack, the man told the woman to bind her husband's hands, which she agreed to do. However, before anything further would happen, the woman cried and pleaded with the masked man not to hurt them. She informed him that she was pregnant. Upon hearing this, the masked man apologized and he quickly left the scene. The police worked to find the man responsible before he could strike again, but they just couldn't find the culprit. News about the masked man spread, creating a great sense of fear throughout Australia, with the police knowing it was just a matter of time until he would strike again. In Tweed Heads on the 2nd of February 1980, a couple were in a car together. They were on a date, and at around 1:30 a.m, 33-year-old Jeff Parkinson opened the passenger door for his girlfriend, when all of a sudden, the masked man appeared. He jumped into the backseat of the car with the rifle in his hand and demanded they drive to a secluded location. The masked man did his usual thing, telling the woman to tie up Jeff, but Jeff decided to fight back. Jeff lunged towards the masked man, and a fight ensued. Jeff turned to his girlfriend and told her to run. And so she did. Jeff fought on as she fled from the scene looking for help. The woman was able to flag down a man who happened to be driving by, but as the man pulled over, gunshots were heard in the distance. The police were called and they arrived on the scene. An officer recalls that day. I remember going there that night and the scene was eerie. The woman was absolutely distraught. The officers found Jeff dead with 3 gunshot wounds. The masked man was now a murderer. The officer went on to say, "We'd known about him for a long time, but this was the first time he resorted to murder. Seeing Jeff's body next to the car alongside a quiet creek, I just said to myself, I've got to get this monster behind bars." And with this, the case of the Balaclava killer became one of the biggest manhunts in Australian history. He would strike again later that year. A woman in the Gold Coast was home alone in her flat on the 31st of October 1980. The Balaclava killer broke into her apartment and forced himself upon her before fleeing on a motorbike. After this attack, he disappeared, never to be seen again. The attacks launched a huge investigation. Due to the last attack, over 5,000 motorcyclists in the area where the attacks had occurred were interviewed by the police, and DNA was taken from hundreds of potential suspects. Despite their best efforts, the police still couldn't find the masked man. Investigators managed to track down the gun they believed was used by the Balaclava killer and traced it to a gun shop at West Burleigh. The owner of the gun shop pulled up the records, and as I said earlier, the masked man had used the name Mark Chapman and had given a fake address. They had no way of finding him. The shop owner saw the man's face and described him looking similar to how the victims described him from what they could see through his homemade balaclava. He had the same eyes and hair colour. But sadly nothing else came from this information, and over the years the case went cold and was closed. In 2008, the case was reopened. DNA evidence was reviewed by police in hopes of solving the string of disturbing crimes, but their efforts proved to be unsuccessful. The lead investigator who attempted to track down the Balaclava killer says that he often loses sleep over the fact he never found the monster. There is one theory as to who the Balaclava killer could be, a despicable man named Ashley Colston. Ashley is an Australian triple murderer who is currently serving 3 sentences of life imprisonment for killing 3 people in Melbourne in 1992. Now here is where things get rather strange. The Balaclava killer stopped abruptly in the 1980s, which is when Ashley moved to Sydney. Ashley also owned a black motorbike and was known to frequent the area where the attacks took place. Ashley also shares a rare blood type with a person believed to be responsible for the crimes of the Balaclava killer. And not only this, Ashley also had a .22 caliber rifle, the one that the Balaclava killer would use in his attacks. He even bought the weapon with a fake name. At some point in the late 80s, Ashley travelled to Melbourne, and it's in the 80s in Melbourne when Mr. Cruel began his reign of terror. Mr. Cruel is the name given to an unidentified Australian killer who attacked 3 girls and murdered 1 in Melbourne in the late 80s and early 1990s before abruptly stopping. He was known to wear a balaclava during these attacks, and the police actually believe that the Balaclava killer may have moved to Melbourne in the 80s. Mr. Cruel began his attacks in the 1980s and abruptly stopped in 1991, and Ashley Colston was arrested in 1992. Neither Mr. Cruel nor the Balaclava killer have committed any further crimes since Colston's arrest. Whether or not Ashley is the Balaclava killer and or Mr. Cruel remains open to speculation, but many have refuted these claims. According to the Gold Coast Bulletin, the former Assistant Police Commissioner, Eric Strong, said that he had no doubt that the Balaclava killer was imprisoned for other crimes. The crimes still haunt him to this day. He said when he gets a quiet moment, he thinks about the attacks and the murder committed by the Balaclava killer. He says, "It stuck with me for all of these years. He's the one that got away. The fella has probably been captured in another state and is serving time there for murders, but I don't have that assurance. I fear that he hasn't faced up to the justice he deserves. He would have to be in jail because he'd still be attacking. We'd still be hearing about the Balaclava killer. The terrifying case of the Balaclava killer is still no closer to being solved. Not even a $50,000 reward has helped the police solve the crime, and he remains one of the most wanted men in Australia. That is, if he is still out there.